Hi, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, wildlife control consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Hey, glad to have you on board. I hope your week went well. I continue to sort of dig out, but I think I am seeing the promised land. So I have got one project kind of completed, so I'm happy about that, but moving obviously onto others. So if you're new to the show, if you're wondering what we're all about, well, Living the Wildlife is all about providing research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest control. That is, animals that have a spine. So you may know of it as wildlife control. So we do at times delve into some insects, but that's not really our focus. We only deal with insects insofar as they're related to the vertebrates that they're associated with. So this isn't a traditional pest control podcast. We focus on animals that have a spine. So we get a little geeky here. So we really delve into some of the scientific literature and talk about things that aren't ordinarily talked about at various training events. So we kind of get into some of the weeds. So this is not your ordinary podcast. But anyways, we're glad to have you on board. If you enjoy the show, we'd hope you'd subscribe to the channel, ring the bell so you can be notified of updates and new podcasts. If you want to go to an alternative outlet, you can go to Rumble and just look up Wildlife Control Consultant. Wildlife Control Consultant, and you can get my podcast there. Often my podcast is published there quicker than it is on the alternative site as well. If you have questions, comments, criticisms, perhaps you'd like to be on the show or you want to suggest a show for us, you can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you, your thoughts, and we welcome guests on the show. We think there's a lot of information that hasn't been getting out to the wider community, and we want to be sure we assist in that. Again, just reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you again. Well, this week, I'm going to be talking about the control of Norway rats. As you know, we've had several podcasts, of course, dealing with bears. I'm not quite finished with bears yet. I think I've got at least one more podcast to talk about for bears, but I'm just not going to talk about that. I thought I would... I decided just to give you a break and get into this one because I found an article that was rather interesting. Now, you may know of different things about how do you census, how do you determine how many animals are in a given location. Like, you ever go to a place and say, well, how many rats are here, right? How do we determine those types of numbers? So let me pull up this particular article. And it's about censusing rats, right? Just like we have a census in the United States every 10 years to find out how many people are living within our country. Well, you as a pest control professional or wildlife control professional may have situations where you want to find out, well, how many rats are there? Or what is the tipping point by which we need to determine that we need to act, right? Because not every situation requires zero rats, like particularly if we're dealing with agricultural situations. Now, often when we're working in residential or urban areas, they want zero rats, right? But even then, at times, that may not always be practical or cost effective. In other words, if you get rid of all the rats but you're bankrupt, well, then that really doesn't help the client anywhere, right? So anyways, the idea being is that what are some methods to determine how many rats there are in a given area? And so the article is entitled Correlation of Two Census Methods, and the two census methods are food consumption and gnawing evidence for assessing Norway rat population. So we're only dealing with the brown rat here, also known as the Norway rat or Rattus norvegicus, right? For those of you who use the scientific name. And it was written by Xiao Pin Yo, Rex E. Marsh, the late Rex E. Marsh, and then Terrell P. Salmon, and it was published in 1987, it looks like here, in the ASTM, which is the American Society for Testing and Materials. So it's a kind of prestigious to get a publication in that particular journal or society, because they really delve into testing methods, right? And so that's obviously, well, how do you determine how many rats are in a particular location? So let me kind of go over that title again for you. So it's correlation of two census methods, food consumption and gnawing evidence for assessing Norway rat populations. And so why would we need to census rat numbers? Well, to get an idea of how big of a problem there is. And it also can be helpful, especially for those people in agricultural situations where they're never probably going to get rid of all the rats. It's sometimes helpful to know when the population's getting to a point where the damage is going to be so severe that it's profitable or cost effective to perform control, right? Sort of like when the population rises to a certain point, well, we need to address that before, because the damage beyond that point is going to be too severe. But the only way you're going to know that is you have to have some way to monitor the population. But the monitoring has to be cost effective and easy to use as well. So they were using these two methods to see how well they correlated to one another. So let's kind of get into the details on that. So the study involved sort of a, not captive, that's probably too strong of a word, but it's kind of, but they were wild Norway rats, but they were held in a facility that was 32 meters by 32 meters. So it's a square facility, pretty big when you think of 30, meters over a yard, right? So over 100 yards. So it's a pretty big area, and rats were kept there, and they were being fed a ration of Purina rodent laboratory. Now I say ration, they were fed as much food as they wanted to eat. And so they basically were determining, they kind of had an idea how many rats were there, and they determined, well, how much food are they eating a day? And the answer was 23.8 grams of Purina rodent laboratory chow per rat per day. Okay, and that's at a 95% confidence interval, right? So obviously there's variation. So they're pretty confident that they have the particular number. And they argued here that this was a sensitive way of determining population numbers, right? So basically what you do is you put enough food out, and depending on how much is consumed, when you find out how much is consumed, you just simply do the math, do the division, and come out, all right, well, if we had, 30 pounds consumed, and we put the number in, well, then you have so many rats on a daily, eating this much food on a daily basis, and you do the math. Very simple process. You may do this on your own in urban areas, where if you have bait stations with a certain amount of bait blocks, and they're consumed at a particular rate. Of course, those are usually have rodenticide in them, so it's a little different. This has no rodenticide in it, but you could do some non-toxic blocks and determine population numbers that way, determining how much food was being consumed. Now, they basically did the same thing in this situation, and what they did was they took paraffinized grain block, which was non-toxic, and they used that as a consumption indicator. But they also wanted to find out if a gnawing evidence could also be used. So they basically used surveyor stakes made out of ponderosa pine. You can go to any hardware store and pretty much pick these up. And they used those, they would pound them into the ground and use those as a way of determining rodent populations, rat populations in this case, on the basis of gnaw damage. So they used the paraffinized grain for consumption indicator, and then they used the ponderosa pine surveyor stakes, and they distributed these items evenly throughout the 32 by 32 meter enclosure, right? And I think it was every 9, I think there were 9 across, 9 down. Okay, so they had at least 81 of each of these items evenly distributed in that 32 by 32 meter enclosure. Okay, and then they would check them every other day, So for the blocks, they would weigh them, so they knew how much they weigh when they put them out, and then they would collect them and then weigh how much was left. That would give them the feeding indicator. And then on the wood, they would determine whether it was gnawed or was it not gnawed. If it was gnawed, it was given a numeral 1. If it wasn't, it'd be given a numeral 0. And then they averaged, they took the entire number, all 81, and determined on a sort of a fractional basis, 40 out of 90 were gnawed and that sort of thing. And then if once one was gnawed, they'd take a black magic marker and they would close off, they would blacken the spot that was gnawed, so when they came back 2 days later, they wouldn't be double counting the gnaw. Pretty easy, pretty simple strategy for determining the census methods here, right? And so it's rather fascinating. So what were the results of this? Well, what they found was that the two census methods were correlated. Now, correlation just means that they move together in a relatively consistent way. So depending on the population. So in terms of the numbers of boards that were being gnawed on and the amount of food was consumed, there was a rather loose correlation between them, right? It was correlated, but it wasn't precise, right? So they found that the food consumption was far more precise in terms of an indicator of population, right? But it's also easier to measure. And that since you're measuring it down to the gram, where with the wooden stakes, was it gnawed or was it not gnawed? Now keep in mind, this particular type of testing is primarily used for agricultural settings, but there's no necessary reason why it couldn't be used or adapted. Perhaps you might want to give it a trial run in urban areas, or perhaps you're dealing with someone who may be raising chickens and they have a lot of rat problems and you need to kind of get an indication there. It's something you may want to think about. See, these are things that are usually for longer term type projects, or projects where there is a consistent problem with rats over time, right? So something for you to think about. Now, what they found is they found in terms of a frequency distribution, in other words, how often was the food eaten in certain locations and how often were the boards, the surveyor stakes, gnawed on in this particular area. And you'll notice that the food consumption tended to occur more in the center of that facility, where the gnawing of the surveyor stakes was more evenly distributed across the entire area of the 32 by 32 meter enclosure. Interesting, right? Because they were both distributed, both the food and the stakes were evenly distributed. In fact, they were paired together throughout the entire facility. So there were 81 blocks and there were 81 stakes, right? 9 by 9 grid was used. So that's a rather interesting thing, just to see how the gnawing damage occurred over a wider area than the food consumption. And so the question that I would have is, was there a relationship of food consumption with where the burrows were? But that wasn't part of the article, right? That would be the question I would have. In other words, are rats more likely to feed at food closer to their den, but more likely to gnaw in areas farther away from their den? Or was that really an indication of the dominant rats, right, who would be more willing to go farther afield? Don't know the answer to that, but that's something you might want to think about for those of you that do a lot of rat work. So the researchers wanted to go at this information in another way, and what they looked at was what's called space utilization, right? And so this was the question. So what this means was how well in the area were the rats working. And so this is what they have in terms of space utilization. Now, the area enclosed by solid lines shows where the gnawing was taking place. But the area that's enclosed with dotted lines, that is where the food was being consumed. So just as we saw in the previous pictures, the food tended to be consumed in the center portion of the enclosure, where the gnawing occurred over a wider area in this enclosure. Interesting phenomenon here. It's why that is taking place. And so it's what they found was ultimately is that the gnawing indices were a better indicator of rat presence in this particular study that was done. Now, of course, researchers always say more research needs to be done over different population numbers and different areas, and the answer to that is of course. But I'm giving you this information here because just for something for you to think about when you are working in areas that may have long-standing rodent problems, or maybe you get those bigger contracts that are covering rodent control over larger acreages, that you may need to start thinking about creating a metric to find those tipping points when you need to start initiating control in certain places. Unless your client has deep pockets and wants to try to control things down to zero, right? But that's over large acreages, that's probably not going to happen per se. It's very difficult to do. They did have some caveats, the researchers for this particular study. They said, understand that the gnawing was a better indicator because it was not subject to competing food sources. In other words, a rat is going to gnaw even if it's well fed. But if a rat is well fed by alternate foods, it may not consume the paraffinized bait, right? And so I didn't really mention it very much, but notice how the paraffinized bait more had to be consumed because it's not as nutritious as the Purina lab chow, right? So understand that some rats may not be interested in a paraffinized bait if there's a lot of alternative food available, right? So they had complete control over the availability of food, other than they said some invertebrates, for example. Like you could have some insects that fell into the enclosure and that sort of thing. But otherwise, there wasn't another outside food source here. But nevertheless, it's also pointing out that the steaks are cheap. They're not expensive to use, nor are they expensive. They're not expensive to purchase, and they're not expensive to use, right? So if you can put some of these steaks out into a wider area, and again, you want to create that grid pattern so that they're evenly distributed across the landscape, or whatever type of testing area that you want to deal with, it could be an important tool for you in determining rat pressure, rat density, and some numbers here. And so in some cases, they found it would be a more sensitive indicator of rat presence, because rats are going to gnaw whether they're filled up with food or not. Interesting. There's so much to learn about rodents, in terms of like rats, in terms of their behavior. So just something in the back of your mind that you may want to just think about, or perhaps when you see gnaw damage on a property, ask yourself, what could this possibly tell me about rodent numbers in this particular area? Why, and look for that type of activity. Now, just as a note, how do you tell it's rat damage as opposed to mouse damage? Well, rat gnawing tends to be 3 to 4 millimeters in diameter, where mouse gnawing is 1 to 2 millimeters in diameter. So definitely keep that in mind. Well, I hope that sort of stimulated your thoughts and interest there. And again, you can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Really glad to have you on board. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, and definitely, if you have questions, comments, thoughts, definitely reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. And keep killing those Norway rats out there. We need more of that type of control. And we really thank you for the type of work you do and the kind of protections that you provide the public, which is certainly underappreciated. So during this busy season, I do hope you find a little bit of time to relax and prepare, because obviously the colder colder months are coming. So stay tuned for future podcasts here with Living the Wildlife. And this is Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Well, because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.
This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast for Living the Wildlife Podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here.